There's a guy who probably has more living descendants than anyone else in human history. He spoke a language he could not write, ran an empire bigger than Alexander's and Rome's combined, and personally signed off on enough death that scientists can measure his career in tons of carbon dioxide. You have heard his name about 1,000 times. You almost certainly do not know who he was, because most of what you learned came from people he was actively trying to delete, which is not exactly an unbiased source. So today, we are correcting the record on a starving teenager from a tent in the middle of nowhere who became, by accident and on purpose, the single most consequential human being of the second millennium. His name was not even Genghis. Let us get the name wrong out of the way first, because it is wrong. The man was born Temujin, which depending on which historian you ask, either means blacksmith, or is a reference to a defeated Tatar prisoner his father had just dragged home. Yes, that is correct. His dad named him after the loser of a recent fight. That tracks for a culture where you proved you existed by raiding people and then naming your children after the receipts. The Genghis Khan part came decades later, when he was already in his 40s and had bullied, married, or strategized his way into uniting every tribe on the steppe. It is a title, not a name, and even the meaning is debated. Some scholars say it means universal ruler. Others argue it might come from a Turkic word for ocean, because the Mongols liked metaphors about the unlimited bigness of the boss. In English-speaking countries, we settled on Genghis. The Mongols themselves usually say Chinggis. Pick whichever you can spell without looking. Neither is what his mother shouted across a yurt when dinner was ready. And, to make the naming chaos worse, our single best Mongol source on his life, a document called The Secret History of the Mongols, was written by his own scribes about a decade after he died, and almost everyone else wrote about him in Chinese, Persian, or Arabic, none of which agree on the spelling. So before we even get to his life, the man has 3 names and 0 authorized portraits, already winning. Kidnapped at 15, hiding in a river, his childhood was, technically speaking, a disaster. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father Yasuge was poisoned by some Tatars who recognized him on the road, which is the medieval equivalent of being shanked at a gas station by a guy who remembers your face. The family was promptly abandoned by their entire clan, because in steppe culture, if you cannot defend your livestock, then congratulations, you are now luggage. His mother Holun kept her kids alive by foraging for roots and berries and small rodents that today would be sold ironically at a hipster restaurant in Brooklyn. Then it got worse. A rival tribe called the Taichiyud rolled up and grabbed Temujin specifically, because they knew his father had been a chief, and were afraid the kid might grow up and start remembering things. They locked him in a wooden collar called a kangu, which is essentially a portable set of stocks that pins your hands next to your face so you cannot feed yourself. He stayed that way for months. Then one night, during a feast, he saw his window. He used the kangu itself to bonk a guard, ran for the Onon River, and floated in the freezing water with only his face poking up between the reeds. A man named Sorkhan Shira spotted him, decided not to rat him out, and later hid him under a wagon full of wool until the search parties got bored. That guy almost certainly did not realize he had just made the single most consequential decision in the entire 13th century. Imagine being the person who chose mercy over a 5-second snitch and accidentally producing the Mongol Empire. Sorkhan Shira deserves a holiday. The bride theft that started a career. Temujin grew up, scraped together a tiny gang of childhood friends, and at around 16 got engaged to Borde, a girl from the Ongarat tribe his father had arranged for him before getting poisoned. The wedding actually happened, which on the steppe was already a minor miracle. Then a tribe called the Merkits showed up to settle an old grudge, because Temujin's father Yasuge had years earlier stolen Hoelun from a Merkit man. Yes, his mother had been kidnapped on her wedding day, and the Merkits had been waiting decades to even the score. They did not get Holun back, who was now Temujin's mom, so they took Borte instead. Temujin spent the next several months scraping together every favor he had ever earned in his short life, then rode out with 2 allies, a powerful older friend named Togrul and his blood brother Jamuka, and recovered her. The catch is that when Bort came back, she was visibly pregnant. The timing was, to put it charitably, ambiguous. The baby, named Jochi, was raised as Temujin's eldest son and given his full love and authority. Whether Jochi was biologically his was a topic absolutely nobody dared bring up out loud, but everyone whispered about for the next century. Jochi's descendants ran the Golden Horde, which controlled Russia and Eastern Europe for 200 years on top of a paternity question mark that never got resolved. The lesson of Temujin's 20s is that on the steppe, if someone took something from you, you went and got it back, and you did not discuss the receipt afterward. Half of his future law code was basically a war on this exact problem. The kidnapping of Borte also marks the moment Temujin stopped being a survivor and started being an operator. He kept count of who helped him when he had nothing, and he spent the rest of his life either rewarding those people lavishly or, in the case of his blood brother Jamuka, eventually having to game over him on a quiet hillside many years later when their friendship collapsed into a power struggle for the steppe. Loyalty in, loyalty out. With absolutely no exceptions for childhood best friends. Brutal accounting. No, he did not look like a tall pale Viking. The internet has decided Genghis Khan was a 6'3" redhead with bright blue eyes who looked like a Norse metal singer. This is dumb, and you should stop sharing those AI portraits. The single source for the red hair and green eyes claim is a Persian historian named Rashid al-Din, writing in the early 1300s, about 100 years after Genghis was already in the ground, and using third-hand stories filtered through people who really wanted to sound exotic in their own histories. Reality check. There are exactly 0 images of Genghis Khan that he personally approved because he banned portraits and statues of himself while he was alive. The closest thing we have is a painting done decades after his death by a Yuan dynasty court artist who never met him. That guy painted him as, surprise, a Mongolian guy. Palm eyes, dark hair, big beard, the standard issue Mongol look you see if you go to Mongolia today. As for the height, modern estimates put him around 5'7" or 5'8", which was tall for his time but is not breaking any door frames at IKEA. He was famously physically tough, allegedly built like a wrestler, and described as having a flowing mane and a calm voice that he used at maximum volume, only when somebody had really earned it. The tall white guy thing is a 19th and 20th century European fantasy where Western writers could not handle the idea of being conquered by people who did not look like them and retroactively painted him into Aryan cosplay. There is a whole subgenre of bad 1930s scholarship on this, mostly published in places that should be embarrassed about it now. Stop posting the AI redhead. He looked like every other Mongol guy at the buffet line. The first constitution nobody reads. Once Temujin finally united the Mongol tribes in the year 1206, a grand council called a Kurultai met under a giant white tent and declared him Genghis Khan, which functionally meant universe boss. Then he did something genuinely unusual for a warlord. He wrote a law code. It was called the Yasa, and while most of the actual text has been lost, we know enough from later sources to say it was wild for its century. Sample provisions. Religious leaders of every faith were exempt from taxes and military service. That meant Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, Christian priests, and Taoist sages all sat at his court arguing theology while he chuckled and refused to pick a side. He banned the kidnapping of women, which is, considering how he met his wife, a galaxy-brain piece of self-improvement legislation. He banned the selling of women into marriage. He outlawed kidnapping enslaved people from other owners. He set up a meritocracy where if you were a competent shepherd, you could end up commanding 1,000 horsemen, and if you were a noble who could not steer a horse, you were getting demoted to whatever the Mongol equivalent of dishwasher was. He also installed mandatory animal welfare rules for hunting seasons, washing protocols for drinking water sources so people would stop dumping in their neighbors' rivers, and the death penalty for spying, theft, and adultery, because the Mongols did not really do middle grounds on punishment. The Yasa applied to him too. The Khan was not above the law. He banned the very uncomfortable time of suspects before trial, which is to say, he forbade torturing prisoners to get confessions, a policy Europe was not going to figure out for another 400 to 500 years. None of this stopped him from game-overing entire cities when they got out of line. But credit where credit is due, the man was a paperwork nerd with a surprisingly progressive HR handbook, the insult that cost an empire its existence. In 1218, Genghis Khan tried something boring. He sent a peaceful trade caravan of about 450 Muslim merchants westward into the Khwarazmian Empire, a wealthy Persianate state ruling modern Iran, Afghanistan, and most of Central Asia. He wanted silk routes, not war. The governor of a border city called Otrar, a guy named Inalchuk, took one look at the merchants, decided they were spies, and game-overed the entire caravan. He kept the gold. One survivor escaped to bring the news back. Genghis, who at this point was a famously composed individual with several decades of self-control under his belt, did not immediately invade. He sent diplomats. He asked the Khwarazmian Shah Muhammad to please hand over the governor, or at minimum pay the families of the dead merchants. Muhammad's response was to behead the chief envoy, shave the beards off the others as an extra insult, and send them home that way. This is where things went sideways. Genghis reportedly climbed a mountain by himself, prayed for 3 days and 3 nights, came back down, and then ended the Khwarazmian Empire so completely that some of its cities never recovered to this day. The campaign of 1219 to 1221 was, in pure scale, one of the most catastrophic things that has ever happened to a region. Otrar was leveled, and the governor Inalchuk, according to Persian sources, was captured alive and finished off by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, because if you insult the boss, you also insult his sense of creativity. Bukhara was burned to the ground. The people of Samarkand were ordered to evacuate to a plain outside the city, where most of the survivors were sorted. the artisans kept as slaves, and the rest game overed. The Khwarazmian Shah ran for his life, hid on an island in the Caspian Sea, and died of pneumonia in his underwear. The empire was gone within 2 years. All because one provincial governor thought 450 merchants and a few camels worth of silk looked sketchy. Worst middle management decision in human history. The internet, but with horses. For someone who never owned a city until middle age, Genghis Khan had a suspiciously slick grasp of logistics. The single most underrated thing he built was the YAM, a continent-spanning postal relay system. The basic idea was simple. Every 20 to 30 miles across the entire empire, there was a station with fresh horses, food, hot meals, and a place to sleep. A government messenger carrying official orders could swap horses at each stop and travel 200 miles in a single day, which in the 13th century was genuinely insane. By contrast, the average European king's news arrived by a guy on a tired horse who maybe wrote things down in a wet notebook and stopped at inns where the owner might rob him. The YAM was so fast that it functionally compressed the empire's reaction time from months to days, which is how the Mongols could coordinate invasions across thousands of miles without WhatsApp, group chats, or the ability of most of their officers to read. Merchants, foreign dignitaries, and approved travelers also got passports that exempted them from local taxes and provided armed escort along the route. Marco Polo's famous golden tablet, the Paisa, was basically a Mongol Empire all-access pass that let you crash at any government inn for free, requisition fresh horses, and walk through hostile territory under the personal protection of the Khan. The YAM outlasted Genghis by centuries. The Russian Tsars copied it. The Ming dynasty copied it. The Persian Safavids copied it. The American Pony Express, several hundred years later in Nevada and California, was a direct philosophical descendant. He invented the package tracking number while wearing fur. The wider effect was even bigger than the mail. Because the YAM made the trade routes safe and the Mongols enforced a continent-wide peace called the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road went into its all-time golden age. For about a century, a single merchant could in theory travel from Beijing to the Black Sea without ever leaving the protection of Mongol law, paying local tolls, or worrying about regional bandits, because the regional bandits had been game-overed and replaced with Mongol customs officers. Paper, printing technology, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, the wheelbarrow, advanced metallurgy, Persian astronomy, Arabic medical texts, and 1,000 smaller innovations all moved from east to west along his road system in this window. The fact that you can buy noodles in Italy is partially his fault. The fact that Europe figured out cannons in time for the Renaissance is partially his fault. He was, in a strange sense, the first globalization CEO. He killed so many people, the planet got cooler. Now for the dark part, and we are not skipping it. Estimates of how many people died because of Genghis Khan's campaigns range from a low of around 15 million to a high of over 100 million. The most cited median number from serious historians is around 40 million, which at the time was roughly 10% of the entire human population on Earth. To get a sense of scale, that is like wiping out everyone currently living in Argentina, except spread across China, Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe, and accomplished without a single firearm. Just bows, spears, hooves, and extremely good horse management. The destruction was disproportionately concentrated in cities that resisted, which Genghis viewed as a teaching moment for whoever might be watching from the next city. Surrender immediately, you got taxes and a Mongol garrison and were largely left alone. Resist, and the city was unmade as a public service announcement. Entire Persian cities like Merv and Nishapur, which had been major centers of science and poetry, were depopulated to the point where they took 500 years to recover their previous size. Some never did. In 2010, a group of researchers at the Carnegie Institution actually quantified the environmental side effect of this much death. Their conclusion was wild and a little uncomfortable. The Mongol invasions killed so many farmers and emptied so much agricultural land in Asia that forests grew back over the abandoned fields. Those regrown forests pulled an estimated 700 million tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere over the course of a century or two. In other words, Genghis Khan was, accidentally, the single most effective climate activist in human history. Do not put that on a t-shirt. He was not trying to save the trees. He was trying to make a point about not insulting his ambassadors. But the math is the math. His career has a measurable, negative carbon footprint, and that is not a sentence I ever thought I would have to write. The death and the tomb nobody can find. Genghis Khan died in August 1227, somewhere in his mid-60s, while leading a campaign against the Tangut Kingdom in what is today northwestern China. Beyond that, almost nothing about his death is clear. The History of Yuan, a Chinese source written about a century later, says he felt ill for 8 days and then died. That is it. That is the whole official record. Naturally, this has spawned 1,000 theories. One says he fell off his horse during a hunt and never recovered from internal injuries. Another says he caught typhoid. Another points to the bubonic plague, which was already moving along his trade routes. Another claims he was finished off by a captured Tangut princess who hid a sharp implement in her clothing on their wedding night, which is almost certainly a later Mongolian folk legend, designed to make a depressing death sound more interesting at parties. The most boring theory, which is probably correct, is that he was an old man in armor, in a hot summer on horseback, waging a brutal campaign, and his body just gave up. His will reportedly demanded that his death be kept secret until the Tangut capital was taken. His army actually pulled this off. They game-overed the Tanguts first, then announced the boss had been dead the whole time. Imagine your manager being on PTO permanently, and the team not telling clients for a month. That was his funeral. The body was hauled back across the steppe to be buried somewhere near a sacred mountain called Burkhan Khaldun, in modern Mongolia. Probably, we are not actually sure, because the Mongols took burial secrecy to a level that bordered on performance art. The legend says 1,000 horsemen escorted the funeral procession, then game-overed anyone they met along the road to prevent witnesses. After the burial, those same horsemen were allegedly game-overed by a second group of soldiers, who were then in turn game-overed by a third group. By the end, you had concentric circles of dead witnesses radiating from a grave nobody could find. Then, according to some accounts, they ran a herd of 1,000 horses across the burial site to crush any trace of digging, and a river was diverted to flow over the grave permanently. Modern archaeologists, including a National Geographic team using satellites and ground-penetrating radar, have spent decades hunting. They have found nothing usable. There are sacred no-go zones in Mongolia where locals would rather not have foreigners poking around with shovels, and the Mongolian government has been polite but extremely firm. They do not particularly want anyone to find the grave. He has been dead for almost 800 years, and he is still winning hide-and-seek. 16 million living descendants and counting. In 2003, a genetic study led by Chris Tyler Smith at the University of Oxford published a finding that broke the science internet of its day. They identified a single Y chromosome lineage carried by about 1 in 200 men alive on Earth right now. That is roughly 16 million men. The lineage radiates outward from Mongolia, lights up across the entire former Mongol Empire from Korea to Hungary, and was clearly turbocharged across Eurasia, somewhere around 800 years ago. That timing lines up suspiciously well with one specific guy, and his son systematically taking control of the largest contiguous land empire that has ever existed. Now, technically, the geneticists cannot prove this lineage is Genghis himself. We have no body, so we cannot test his DNA directly. But circumstantially, the population spread, the timing, and the geographic center of gravity all point at him or his immediate family. The popular framing is that Genghis Khan personally fathered millions of descendants, which is a bit much even by his standards. He had 4 official sons with Borte, who were his political heirs, but he also had dozens of other children with secondary wives, and his sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons spent generations as the dominant ruling class across half the planet, with all the access to food, security, and reproductive opportunity that came with being royalty. The math compounded. Either way, if you are a man living anywhere from Korea to Hungary, there is a real, non-trivial chance that you are technically a 30-something great-grandson of a guy who once game-overed a city of 500,000 people for being rude to his ambassadors. Family reunion would be awkward. Bring extra chairs. What the history books got wrong. Here is the part where the historian in me has to start fighting the comedian. Most of what Western audiences learned about Genghis Khan, especially in school, comes from sources written by people he conquered, which is roughly equivalent to learning about your boss from his fired employees. That includes Persian historians who watched their cities burn, Chinese chroniclers writing under the Ming dynasty, which had taken power specifically by overthrowing his grandson's empire and had every motive to paint the Mongols as barbarians, and Russian monks whose ancestors had been ruled by the Golden Horde for 200 years and were not going to write fanfiction about the experience. None of those people are unbiased. The image of the screaming barbarian on a horse, the image of the empire as a fire and skull pyramid, the assumption that nothing good ever came out of Mongolia, all of it traces back to them. The reality, according to a generation of newer historians, like Jack Weatherford in his book Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, is messier and a lot weirder. Yes, he game-overed cities. Yes, he was responsible for tens of millions of deaths. But he also institutionalized full religious freedom 400 years before the European Enlightenment got around to it. He created the largest free trade zone the world had ever seen. He standardized weights and measures across Asia. He outlawed the very uncomfortable time of suspects before trial. He invented diplomatic immunity, which is exactly why he lost his mind when Khwarazm beheaded his envoys. He set up the first international postal service. He gave women legal protections that medieval Europe would not match for centuries. He could not read. He could not write. He had no city. He grew up eating rodents in a tent and was once chained in a wooden collar so heavy he had to be fed by hand. And he engineered the world for the next 800 years from horseback. The villagers in his childhood who let his mother starve probably regretted that one for 1,000 miles. That is, in the end, why he is still in our mouths today. Not because he killed. Plenty of warlords killed, and you do not know their names. He won, he built, and he won again, and he made sure nobody could find his grave to spit on it. 800 years later, we still cannot.